Awesome. Hi. Thank you so much for having me here today. I'm really excited to be here. Um, this is my second day in Paris ever, so I'm super thankful for being able to have such a cool experience here and being able to come. But what I'm here to talk about today is collaborative user research. So bringing the team along for the ride and what research can look like as a team effort that helps everybody in the team learn about users, whether those people in the team are UX people, whether they're designers, whether they're product people, engineers, or whether they're somebody else completely. And what it really looks like to pull those team members in, include them, use their brain power, and give everybody around us the opportunity to learn directly from users the way UX people do, and show rather than tell those learnings, and why it's so much more effective. But really quickly, a little bit about me. So my name's Nicola. I'm Australian. If you can't tell from my accent, please forgive the accent. I hope you can understand. I'll try not to use too many Australianisms. So I've been a designer for around about the last 10 years. And today I would consider research to be a really non-negotiable part of that design work for me. So a lot of the work I do is sort of 50-50 research and design. And I guess the point of the story, I was a consultant for a bunch of time. I used to work for a company called Pivotal Labs. Now I've been consulting independently as doing primarily like product design consulting and coaching teams with their research process for the last year and a half. But yeah, the point of the story is, I guess, what I'm sharing today, this process of user research, comes mostly from the context of product design, mostly in agile software companies. And I'm mostly talking about qualitative user interview focused research. So that's the context for today. And I've only got about 25 minutes of your time, so this is going to be a little bit high level, with some talking about specific techniques and some talking about more like attitudes or philosophies to take with us as we go. And I hope it'll be applicable to you in your context, but on that I would actually love to know who we have in the room in terms of research. So can I have show of hands, who here, like in your work, is owning or part of user research? Just a smattering of hands. Who is part of a team that has other people that are doing user research, but you are not personally part of it? Okay, a couple. Who here is in a team that doesn't do user research at all? Okay, more. Who would like to be involved in more user research? Okay, cool. Yeah, awesome. That's the correct answer. In this context anyway. So there are 4 parts to this super collaborative user research process that I'm going to share today. Number 1 is setting research learning goals as a team. Number 2 is having team members come in and be note takers or co-moderators in user interviews. Number 3 is coming up with insights together. So coming up with our learnings. What did we learn from this research? And number 4 is doing research regularly, right? So having it on a cadence, repeating. And these might seem kind of simple to you. Like I even hope that you're looking at them and thinking, only 4 steps, that seems quite simple, because that really is by design. Because we're talking about the reality of business here. So if we're asking team members, like people who are not specifically employed as researchers, to jump in to research, then we have to make it as low of a barrier to entry as possible for them. So people are already really busy, really stressed out, have a lot on their plates, and to be asking them to jump in for hours upon hours of research is it's just not going to work. So what I'm talking about is a low time commitment from any individual person, something like 4 hours or less per fortnight to actually be part of research. And I just want to, maximize the impact though, that impact being on the team's user-centeredness and everybody else's user-centeredness in the group. So, excuse me. One of the key things that I'm always asking researchers is, who are we doing this learning for, right? It's not really for us. If we're the researcher, we don't need to just learn about users and keep it in our own heads. It's really for everybody else in the team. And if user research doesn't end up in the people around us, whether they be engineers or product people or clients or stakeholders or whoever they are, if it doesn't result in everybody else thinking more about users, then was it useful at all? That's my question. Because empathy for customers and thinking about users, it's everybody's job. No matter what our job title, we should all be thinking about that. Because everybody in a software company makes decisions that affect the end users. Everybody from entry-level engineers all the way up to senior executives, through salespeople or testers, or try to think of anybody in your company who doesn't make decisions that somehow, either directly or indirectly, affect the end users. Just try to think of someone. It's really, really hard to do. So I think that all of those people need to be enabled to have the fullest information possible at their fingertips about users in order to be able to make those decisions that they're making day to day with the users in mind. So I think as researchers, my job as a researcher is to make that information as accessible to everybody as possible. And UX people, we really can't be there to make sure that every decision that gets made is made with users in mind. I think sometimes UX teams are sort of spun up with the idea that these are going to be the people that think about users. But I think that everybody needs to be thinking about users because we can't be there for every decision, of course. And especially, one thing that I talk about all the time is it just kind of hurts me that engineers so often aren't included in design and research activities, because engineers literally are the front line of UX. Engineering teams are the people who are literally building the thing that users experience, right? So of all of the people around in a software company, I think that engineering teams are the people who really, really need that information about users and to be enabled with that. And yeah, so often in all of the different teams that I've been able to work in through being a freelancer, being a consultant, I so often see engineering teams almost being forced to interpret information about users from reading user stories, or from looking at designs, or from jumping into that once a month lunch and learn that the UX team runs, which half the time you don't go to because you're just tired and you want to have a lunchtime without listening to somebody talk. So I think it's really important for engineering teams to have that info about users, but I also think it's really important for design teams and research teams to have that perspective, that engineering perspective in the room, because so often I've found it to be so valuable and so useful, that perspective that technical people bring to the conversation when you're talking about how to potentially solve problems and talking about how do people think about things, right? It's such a different perspective often to the way that I personally think as a creative, that I just find that perspective so useful. So if I'm talking to a room of engineers, I love to try to encourage, you guys definitely belong in those creative and those research conversations, and your perspective is so valuable. I just want to say that. So to the 4 steps that I wanted to talk about. So number 1 is setting learning goals as a team. So at the start of a piece of collaborative user research, I think it's really key to workshop the learning goals and think about what is it that we're actually looking at learning through this research. What's the point of us doing this right now? It's a focus area. So I consider good learning goals to be really clear, specific questions that we can use to drive research. And then come back to at the end of a piece of research and ask ourselves, have we learned the answer? And so this, what I'm going to talk through here, this is something that you can dive into, even if there's not specifically somebody at, if your role isn't specifically researcher, I think that you can dive in and just get started with giving it a go. because we all probably went to high school, we all probably went to university, like we know things about research, yeah? Cool. So there are a lot of ways to come up with learning goals. So I will talk about just one workshop that I like to run to do this. It's looking at risky assumptions and using those to drive learning goals. So the first part of the workshop looks like having everybody brainstorm on the prompt. If we're wrong that blank, this idea will fail. If we're wrong that blah, this idea will fail. So an example of this might be, if we were to look at Airbnb, let's say back in 2008, just when they were getting started. And this is, I've just picked Airbnb as an example that hopefully a lot of people have heard of. So they might have come up with something like, if we're wrong that people would pay to stay in a stranger's house, this idea will fail. So it's very high level, it's very like product focused, we're talking about value propositions here. Or if we were to fast forward and jump into a conversation at Airbnb now, where they might be doing this, then they might come up with something a lot more granular and feature level. So it could be something like, if we're wrong that people search by location for a place to stay, this design will fail, right? So it's a lot more granular, a lot more design focused. And the underlined parts here are the risky assumptions. So people would pay to stay in a stranger's house. People search by location for a place to stay. These are the assumptions that are driving what we're about to build. So whether that's an entirely new startup business idea or whether that's just this new design that we're about to build, assumptions drive it. And that's really normal. In every product, every team ever, there are assumptions driving what we build. So the point of research very often, in my mind, is to test those assumptions and just check if we're right. Pretty often we are right, but let's just check, let's just do a little bit of research, let's just check if we're right before we build the thing, because building it without checking is risky. So those assumptions that we came up before can be turned into learning goals, right? So if you can brainstorm a bunch of different assumptions and then prioritize those in terms of risk, which ones would be riskiest, like worst if we were wrong about it, that turns into learning goals and that becomes what you research. And what's really key is doing it collaboratively, running it as a workshop, means that what you're researching on has been led by the other people in the team, not just yourself. So this brings focus and clarity. So you have these high priority things to focus research on, but also everyone is totally across what the research is happening about and why you're doing it, which is really good for buy-in. I've personally experienced a lot of like having to convince teams to do research at all. So I always try to talk about how to get that buy-in because it is hard, that's the reality. Everybody's voices have been heard, so this is really important as well. You might be focusing research on something that somebody else is really worried about, and then they've been able to actually say it, and they're contributing. And it also kind of creates a bit of a cliffhanger. So we all just kind of work together to come up with a bunch of questions, risky stuff that we're not sure about, and now everybody's waiting to find out the answers. So it's really good for engagement with research as well. So that was number one. Number two is having team members be note takers and or co-moderators when it comes to doing user interviews. So why is this effective? Well, it really works well as a way to get the notes that you need, right? So if you're doing user interviews, you need to get notes. So pulling people in to take notes it's just a really like quick and easy way to get those notes taken. There are other ways to do it. So I guess what I want to say is like having people be note takers, it sounds like unglamorous, but it is a really important job. It really needs to be done. And I just find it such a great way to actually pull people into the process because remember our goal of making the people around us more user-centered? So actually being there in the room and being able to listen directly to a user talking is so much more empathy building than any other way of experiencing those users' stories. So compare it to something like reading a transcript, watching a video, reading a bunch of dot points on a slide. Actually hearing the person talk, it's like miles above. So being able to include people and pull them in, like I love to especially pull in engineers to do this, because I just think that their perspective is so valuable if they can jump in and ask questions at the end. I also think that asking people to dial in on a video link, has anybody ever been sent a video link to dial into a user interview? Okay, yeah, a couple. Yeah, and did you ever decide not to? Yeah. Me too, because I think that it's really boring to dial in and watch two other people talk. Just being honest. Cool. All right, so the other thing that I will do is gradually encourage people who jump into user interviews and take notes to participate. So I think that there's no reason why anybody can't run a good user interview. There's a lot of, there is definitely an art to it. You really need to do some research online, read about how to ask good questions, read about how to create the arc of a user interview, how to sort of not lead the participant with the questions that you're asking. But it's definitely something that anybody can learn, I believe. If you can have a conversation, you can learn it. So if it's something that you're interested in jumping into, I would encourage you to look into that. It's not as hard as it seems, though it does need a lot of practice. So yeah, I will always encourage people who are jumping into interviews over a period of time to write down questions, and then at the end I'll throw over to them, hey, do you have any questions? And let them jump in, and then gradually kind of grow that, from me doing 90% and them doing 10%, I'll just sort of gradually grow it until eventually that person is confident to run their own user interviews. And then that means that, because I'm a consultant, that means that I can leave, and then that team will continue doing research without being reliant on consultants, which I think is better for the customer. Cool. So where are we now? So we set our learning goals. We've done some interviews with users. We have our transcripts written. The third part is coming up with those learnings as a team. So everyone has their own way of doing synthesis or analysis of findings, and I won't go too deeply into it because there are so many different ways. But for me, it normally looks like running a workshop. I like to do it on paper, on the wall. I like to pull all those people in who've been jumping into research, jumping into those interviews, pull them into the room, and we'll play with the post-it notes together, UX style. So I guess my question here, though, is to ask everybody, if you're doing any kind of activity or exercise where we're talking about users or we're talking about learning stuff, how could that look more like a workshop? How could that look more like something where more people from the team are included and people are able to bring their perspectives to the table? So closing this one out, I think it's really key to go back to those learning goals, those things we set at the start. So revisiting them and just asking with the team these questions, did we learn this? Do we have an answer for this now? And what this does is it clearly progresses a team's knowledge through the process of research, so that's good. And by doing it collaboratively, it also clearly shows everybody that that the research did progress us, right? So if we've got those people in the team who don't yet really fully get the purpose of research and why we should do it and why we shouldn't skip it, then actually going back to those learning goals is a really nice way of demonstrating. And number 4 is a regular cadence. So doing research regularly, over and over, repeating it. So this is incredibly helpful. And I guess what I'm talking about here is with the same team. So I'm not talking about doing a big bunch of research up front, but talking about doing little bits over time. For me, that often looks like doing one research round around about every fortnight, so talking to 5 users every 2 weeks. And I find that to be pretty manageable alongside the rest of a product design role. So yeah, I guess what I'm not talking about here is bringing like, one team member into one user interview and then like voila, they're super user-centered at this point. It's talking about bringing people in over a process, over a period of months, over and over with more people, but just only taking up a few of their hours per, let's say, fortnight to do this. So yeah, doing research regularly, I think that's important for a bunch of reasons, for all of the same reasons that agile is important, which I don't think we have time to go into in 25 minutes. But particularly in the research context, it's really important to, I guess, not fall in love with just one user's problems or fall in love with just what you hear from only 5 people, right? So if you're doing this Google Sprint style research with only 5 people, it necessarily needs to be very focused. So you can only look at a couple of learning goals at a time, and it's not really enough to base an entire product on. So we repeat. So those were the 4 steps. And here I want to say that researching collaboratively, it just organically changes, and I've observed this, it organically changes the conversations and the thinking in an entire team to be more user-centered. So take, for example, an engineering conversation. So if we're talking about what framework to choose to implement this new feature that we're building, or implement a new product that we're building. Before that team is part of research, maybe that conversation sounds a little bit like, well, this framework plays better with the systems we have in place already. This framework we have more experience in as a team. This framework is really new and like cool. We're excited about the possibilities we can build with it. But I've seen those conversations change a little bit after those engineering teams become part of user research. And so after that, maybe that conversation sounds a little bit like all of those things, but plus, well, what we know is that the user is going to be most likely using this product while they're on the road, while they're driving around in a car. So when we're thinking about the framework to choose, we need to choose something that is fastest over mobile data and allows us to store data locally, so that it will still work for the users if the reception is patchy. And like what we just got there is a better user experience without any user experience person being there for that conversation. And that's what we want. So products become better when everybody in the team is enabled to take on that responsibility for user experience thinking about users. And more than that, another impact that I've seen, it's actually a little bit more human. If you're listening to people talk directly about their pains and their problems, and then the next week you're going away with your team and you're coming up with solutions and you're building them and shipping them, and then a few weeks later you're seeing more people come in and talk to you and those pains are not there anymore, like that's meaningful work right there, right? That's directly helping people, and that's one of the top things that comes up in any conversation in any field about job satisfaction and like meaning at work. So I think it's sometimes kind of easy to forget that that's what we're doing when we're working in a software company if we're not having that direct contact with users. What we're all trying to do here is help people, right? In whatever it is, whatever way, whatever part of their life our product touches, we're trying to make that part of their life a little bit easier. So I just think that it's really cool that if we're the people in a team who do have that contact with users, that by inviting other people in, we have the power to give that feeling to other people. And I think that if we're not the person who has the contact with users, then trying to like jump in and being open to diving into it, I've only ever seen it be good, not just for products, but also for people, right? So I guess this is the message that I want to leave you with. It's really about attitude. If you're somebody who does research, then it's about being as inclusive and as collaborative as possible with teams and helping people to feel welcome. If you're somebody who's on a team where research is already happening, then I think it's just about being open to jumping in. If your team isn't doing research at all, maybe it's about having those conversations about how could we start, what would it actually look like, and knowing that you don't have to be a designer, you don't have to be a researcher to be able to own that. There's so much information on the internet that you can learn if you want to learn how to do user research in a really small, low time commitment way. Definitely you can do it. And I know this because I have worked directly with tons of different people from different companies, from all sorts of different roles, who are very rarely called researcher. And I've seen them skill up and become really good at research. So, so I think it's about that attitude. And yeah, I think for all of us, it's really about taking responsibility for good user experience, because user experience is everyone's responsibility. Thank you. Any questions? Yeah? Yeah. Do you want to shout it? You say it to me and I'll repeat it.
I guess when you try to implement that system, you encounter fears and resistance. Is it the case, and what do you do to overcome these fears and resistance when it happens?
Fears and resistance from whom?
The engineers team, for instance, or for people who don't want to focus on user experience, or who say that they don't have time, they are not engaged enough with the job to do that.
Yeah. Oh, I'm out of the thing, sorry. So the question was, I guess, trying to implement research in a team and hitting on fear and resistance from people who might not be open to jumping in. Does that kind of cover it? So my answer is yes, I have seen that many times on many occasions. Especially people not having time, or like feeling that they don't have time to jump in. I've tried to tackle this in a few different ways. So the best way to tackle it is to have executive sponsorship. So being able to go to the top, have somebody at the top who's on board with the fact that research needs to happen, and who is able to then use their influence to say, hey, you've got 4 hours per week, and I'm giving you 4 hours per week to do this research. That's the best way. Not always possible. So beyond that, so asking people to be note takers, as a researcher, I've found that to be very useful, because I guess it frames the situation as I need help with this and I can't do my job unless you can give me an hour someone else can give me an hour of their time. And so what I've seen is that gets people in the door, and then once you've been part of it a few times, you can see the point. Yeah, does that answer? Anybody else?
What do you think of methodologies or frameworks like design thinking fit into this principles?
Yeah, so there are tons of different interesting frameworks. I think I had one little graph in there. Yeah, I mean, I think that all of them, design thinking fits really well. Agile, like lean UX and agile design fit really well into this. For me, so if you've read Google Sprints, or if you've got any familiarity with Google Sprints, this will sound very familiar. I think if I was recommending to read just one book with a framework for doing really lightweight user research that doesn't take a lot of money or a lot of time, it would be Google Sprints by Jake Knapp.
Thanks.
Anybody else? Yeah?
You talked about not falling in love with one user problem or one user story, and I feel like for me, one of the difficult thing is that we already have a lot of ideas that we think a lot of people would like. We have a pretty good idea on how to build, but the hardest part for me is to prioritize
Yeah.
what we do with the limited resource that we have. Do you have any advice for this?
Yeah, I do. I pulled out some of my slides because I thought I was over time, and then I think I just talked really fast. So I probably would have had time to go into it. But the best way for prioritizing that I have found is if you see over on the left-hand side, like a 2x2. Are you guys familiar with the 2x2 as a workshop tool? Some nods. So it's basically just a way of prioritizing ideas. And so what that 2x2 would look like on the wall is from top to bottom, most risky if we're wrong about it, to less risky if we're wrong about it. And then from left to right, like we're really sure that we're correct, or we're not so sure that we're correct. So when you've come up with those assumptions, getting everybody to brainstorm those assumptions which look like, if we're wrong, that blah, this idea will fail. Then putting all of those assumptions on this 2x2 with really risky to less risky and really sure about to less sure about. And so what you end up there, it's kind of hard to like picture it without seeing a picture, but what you end up with in the top right-hand corner is assumptions that your team has made that are driving product, like you're driving the product, that would be really bad if we were wrong about it, and that we're less sure about being right. And so you can basically just take the ones from the top right-hand corner and just tackle them like one by one, dominoes. But I have some workshops online. So if you Google like Nicola Rushton assumptions workshop, you can find all the information. I've published it on Medium.
Thank you.
No worries. One more.
Thank you for your talk. My question is, when you have a large base of heterogeneous user profiles,
Of what, sorry?
of heterogeneous,
Yeah.
like contrary to homogeneous,
Yeah.
user profiles. Sorry for my accent. How do you pick up the relevant ones?
Okay,
How do you
I missed one word in there, sorry. If you have a lot of heterogeneous, what?
user profiles?
User profiles.
How do you pick up the relevant ones to interview?
Yeah, this is really, really key. So I would, for one research round, so talking to 5 people, I try to make the persona as small as possible. So is that what you mean by user profile? Yeah, the smallest persona as possible. So if you're only talking to 5 people, those 5 people need to be similar enough to each other that you can draw a conclusion, right? So an example might be, if we're looking at the bottom one, so if we want to do some research on if people search by location for a place to stay is an assumption. So the question, like the learning goal around that might be, how do people search for a place to stay? And I'd be looking at that specific design that we want to test with this and saying, well, it's only relevant if we're talking to people who are mobile users, maybe only Android users, maybe they're only people who are looking for a place, like they're the kind of traveler who is in a place before they look for a place to stay. Or maybe the other way around, trying to make it really, really specific. So that's really, really important. How to choose which persona? Well, I think that if you've prioritized the learning goals, like looked at the riskiest things and then chosen the riskiest thing that we know, the riskiest assumption that we know the least about, often it kind of comes out of that, who is the most important person to talk to, because, yeah. Does that answer?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Cool. Anyone else?
No.
Nope. That's all. Okay, thank you
Thank
so
you.
much.